His home was more than just four walls. It was a treasure trove of memories, love, and family history. But one quiet morning, a letter slid under his door, an eviction notice, citing violations he had never even heard of. The HOA president, smug and untouchable, dismissed his protests with a chilling remark: "It's all legal, and there's nothing you can do." What she didn't realize was that this time, she had picked the wrong fight. What happened next sent shockwaves through the entire community. But let's start from the beginning. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft, golden glow across John Miller's neatly trimmed lawn, when the sound of something sliding under the door interrupted his morning coffee ritual. He looked down to see a crisp, white envelope emblazoned with the HOA's logo. John hesitated for a moment, his heart sinking. In his 20 years of living in this house, a home filled with memories of his late wife and the laughter of his now grown son, he had never had any direct dealings with the HOA. The house was a fortress of nostalgia and peace, built on principles that didn't need meddling from anyone. He tore open the envelope, his calloused fingers shaking slightly. The bolded words at the top of the page hit him like a punch in the gut: "Notice of eviction." His breath caught as he scanned the document. It accused him of violating community bylaws, listing offenses that sounded more absurd with every line: unapproved renovations, unauthorized guests. The kicker came at the end, a demand to vacate the property within 30 days. John slammed the letter on the table, his mind racing. Renovations? Guests? The house hadn't seen a paintbrush since 2010, and his only visitors were his son and a couple of old friends. What kind of nonsense was this? He read further, the legal jargon twisting in his mind. Then he froze. There, tucked between the lines, was the most outrageous claim of all. His property was now part of the HOA, retroactively. Retroactively? He muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. He had never signed any agreement to join the HOA, ever. The bitter taste of injustice crept up his throat. He glanced at the envelope again, noticing the signature at the bottom of the letter: Diane Harper, HOA President. The name alone made his jaw tighten. Diane was a walking stereotype of petty power, known around the neighborhood for her overbearing nature and her uncanny ability to find a problem in paradise. John stepped outside, his boots crunching against the gravel path as he headed toward the HOA office. Diane's office was a makeshift room in her overly manicured backyard, complete with a fountain that seemed to scream, "Look how important I am." He found her sitting behind a desk, surrounded by binders and papers, as if she were presiding over a corporate empire instead of a suburban HOA. "Diane," he started, holding up the letter, "what's this all about? I never agreed to be part of your HOA." Diane didn't even flinch. She leaned back in her chair, giving him a smug smile that made his blood boil. "Oh, John, you really should have read the fine print," she said, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "What fine print?" John shot back. She picked up a folder from her desk and waved it like a trophy. "Last year, we updated the community boundaries. Your house fell into the new territory. It's all perfectly legal." John's fist clenched. "You can't just redraw boundaries without informing the homeowners," he said, his voice firm. "Oh, but we did inform you," Diane replied with a smirk. "We sent notices, certified mail, in fact. If you didn't read them, that's not our fault." It felt like someone had thrown a bucket of ice water over him. "Certified mail? I never received anything." Diane mused, tapping her chin in mock thought. "Maybe you should check with your post office." John stared at her, incredulous. Her casual dismissal, the way she acted as if uprooting someone's life was just another Tuesday, was infuriating. "You're not getting away with this," he said, his voice steady but laced with anger. Diane laughed, a sharp, grating sound. "Good luck fighting it in court, John. HOA lawyers don't lose." As John walked away, he could feel her eyes on his back, her smirk burning a hole in his resolve. He knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. John Miller wasn't the type to roll over and accept defeat. As the echoes of Diane's mocking laughter lingered in his mind, he made his way home, jaw clenched and determination growing with each step. If Diane thought she could scare him off with legal threats, she was in for a rude awakening. The first thing John did when he got home was pull out the dusty box of property documents he'd kept in his attic. The air was thick with the scent of old paper as he spread the documents across his kitchen table, scanning them with an intensity that would make a seasoned detective proud. His eyes stopped on one line, bold and clear. This property is exempt from HOA jurisdiction. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by frustration. Diane had lied, blatantly. "This is my ace in the hole," John muttered, holding the deed like a lifeline. Armed with this irrefutable evidence, he decided to confront Diane at the next HOA meeting. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, an overly decorated space that reeked of artificial authority with its polished wood podium and neatly arranged rows of chairs. Diane stood at the front, wearing her usual smug expression, as she fielded questions from concerned homeowners. When John walked in, holding his documents aloft, the room grew quiet. "Diane," John said, his voice steady but firm, "care to explain why my house is listed as part of the HOA when this deed clearly states otherwise?" Diane glanced at the paper, her smirk widening, as though she'd been waiting for this moment. "Oh, John," she said, laughing lightly, "do you really think a piece of paper from 20 years ago holds up against our updated bylaws? Good luck fighting this in court. We've got lawyers." The room buzzed with murmurs as John stared her down, his anger simmering just below the surface. "You can't just rewrite boundaries and ignore legal documents," he shot back, his voice rising slightly. Diane's laughter filled the room, sharp and dismissive. "We're well within our rights," she said, waving him off like a pesky fly. "If you want to waste your time and money fighting us, be my guest. But trust me, John, it's a losing battle." That night, sitting in his dimly lit living room, John felt the weight of Diane's words. She was confident, too confident. But instead of giving in to despair, he found resolve. He wasn't alone in this fight. The next morning, John visited his neighbor, Margaret, an elderly woman who had lived in the community for decades. Margaret was the unofficial historian of the neighborhood, and if anyone knew the ins and outs of the HOA's shadier practices, it was her. Over cups of tea at her cluttered kitchen table, Margaret shared her own experiences. Fines for untrimmed bushes that weren't hers, threats of legal action for minor infractions, and invasive inspections disguised as safety checks. "She's been targeting single homeowners like you for years," Margaret said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Diane sees us as easy pickings, but if you're going to fight her, count me in." John's frustration deepened when the HOA escalated their tactics. One evening, as he went to fill his coffee pot, he noticed the water pressure was weak, barely a trickle. A quick call to the utility company confirmed his worst fear. The HOA had cut off his water supply, citing unpaid HOA dues he didn't owe. As if that wasn't enough, John awoke the next morning to find a brand new surveillance camera installed on a pole directly outside his front yard. The lens was angled squarely at his house, an unblinking eye that screamed intrusion. A note attached to the pole read, "Installed for community safety." "Community safety, my foot," John muttered, gripping the note tightly. It was clear Diane wasn't just trying to intimidate him, she was trying to break him. But as the anger churned inside him, it only fueled his determination. "Two can play this game," he said, glancing at the stack of documents on his kitchen table. The fight was just beginning, and John was ready to bring it. John Miller sat at his kitchen table, the room dimly lit by the warm glow of a single lamp. The documents he'd collected lay scattered before him, a chaotic mess of evidence that pointed to Diane Harper's overreach. He had done everything he could on his own, combing through records, consulting neighbors, and documenting every unjust action the HOA had taken. But it wasn't enough. He needed professional help. Enter Lisa Torres, a sharp-witted attorney with a reputation for dismantling overreaching HOAs. Lisa was in her late 30s, with an air of confidence that immediately put John at ease. Her office was simple yet professional, with shelves of legal books and a desk that seemed perpetually organized, despite the volume of cases she handled. As John explained his situation, Lisa's expression shifted from curiosity to outrage. "They cut off your water? Installed surveillance cameras? That's not just unethical, it's likely illegal," Lisa said, leaning back in her chair. John nodded, the frustration evident in his voice. "And they keep claiming I'm part of their HOA, despite what my deed says." Lisa tapped her pen thoughtfully before smirking. Diane Harper might think she's untouchable, but let's see how she handles a little sunlight on her operation. The two began their investigation, and what they found was staggering. Lisa dug into the HOA's meeting minutes, financial records, and legal filings, uncovering a pattern of deceit and corruption. First, there were the fake votes. Lisa discovered that Diane had falsified meeting minutes to claim unanimous consent for the HOA's territorial expansion. Homeowners who had never attended the meetings or even lived in the area were listed as voting yes. Then came the shady finances. The HOA's budget, which should have gone toward community improvements, was instead funneled into Diane's personal projects. Receipts and contractor invoices revealed that HOA funds had paid for a luxury pool and patio at Diane's house, complete with an outdoor kitchen and decorative landscaping. And finally, the surveillance cameras. Lisa confirmed that the cameras violated state privacy laws, especially since they were positioned to record private property without the homeowner's consent. "This isn't about safety," Lisa said, shaking her head. "It's about control." John felt a mix of anger and relief as the pieces began to fall into place. Diane wasn't just overstepping her bounds, she was abusing her power on a scale far larger than he had imagined. Determined to gather even more evidence, John took matters into his own hands. He installed a hidden camera on his property, cleverly concealed among the ivy on his fence. Within days, the camera captured footage of HOA contractors trespassing on his land. They were tampering with his water meter, spray painting markers on his lawn, and even removing his garden gnome, a gift from his late wife that had sentimental value. John shared the footage with Lisa, who shook her head in disbelief. "This is gold," she said. "We'll use it to prove they've been trying to intimidate you into compliance." As the case built momentum, John couldn't help but feel a growing sense of hope. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't just reacting to Diane's antics, he was taking the fight to her. But as satisfying as it was to uncover her corruption, John knew the battle was far from over. Lisa filed a formal complaint with the state, backed by the mountain of evidence they had collected. Diane's arrogance had made her careless, leaving a trail of paper and digital footprints that painted a clear picture of her misconduct. Still, John couldn't shake the feeling that Diane wouldn't go down without a fight. As he stood on his porch that evening, watching the surveillance camera in his yard swivel ever so slightly, he smiled grimly. "She wanted a war," he said to himself. "Now she's got one." The courtroom was a battleground. The walls were adorned with dark wood paneling, giving the space an air of solemnity, but the tension in the air was anything but calm. John sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. To his right was Lisa Torres, her sharp gaze fixed on Diane Harper, who was seated confidently at the defense table. Diane exuded her usual smugness, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit that screamed authority. She leaned back in her chair as if this was just another HOA meeting where she could bend the rules to her will. But as the hearing began, that confidence began to crack. Lisa's opening argument was calm and calculated, but every word carried weight. "Your Honor, this case isn't just about one homeowner. It's about the abuse of power, fraudulent actions, and the deliberate targeting of individuals for personal gain." The judge nodded, his stern expression showing he wasn't here for games. "Proceed," he said. One by one, Lisa began to lay out the evidence. The first bombshell was the falsified meeting minutes. Lisa projected them onto the courtroom screen, highlighting the discrepancies. "As you can see, Your Honor, these minutes claim unanimous consent for the HOA expansion. However, several individuals listed as present were either out of town or no longer living in the neighborhood at the time of this meeting." The judge raised an eyebrow, glancing at Diane. Her confident demeanor faltered, but she quickly recovered, whispering to her attorney. Next, Lisa turned to the financial records. The HOA budget, meant for community improvements, was instead funneled into private projects, including a luxury pool at Miss Harper's residence. She presented receipts and invoices, each one damning. The room was silent, save for the quiet rustling of papers as the evidence was passed around. Diane's face flushed, her composed mask slipping further with each revelation. But the pièce de résistance came when Lisa played the surveillance footage John had captured. The grainy video showed HOA contractors on John's property, ripping up his garden and tampering with his water meter. The timestamp left no doubt. It was done under Diane's orders. Diane's attorney tried to object, claiming the footage was inadmissible, but the judge waved him off. "This goes to the heart of the matter," he said. As the video ended, Lisa delivered the final blow. "And now, Your Honor, I present an email mistakenly sent to one of the HOA members instead of its intended recipient." She paused for effect before reading it aloud. In the email, Diane boasted about forcing John out to make way for a higher-paying member. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the damning words hung in the air. Diane's attorney buried his face in his hands, clearly realizing the case was lost. John stole a glance at Diane, whose smug confidence had been replaced by panic. For the first time, she looked small and vulnerable, like a queen stripped of her crown. The judge leaned forward, his expression stern. "Miss Harper, your actions are not only unethical, but also illegal. You have abused your position, violated the rights of your neighbors, and betrayed the trust of your community." The gavel slammed down, echoing through the courtroom. "I hereby rule in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Miller. The HOA is ordered to pay $100,000 in damages, cover all legal fees, and issue a formal apology to Mr. Miller. Furthermore, Ms. Harper is removed from her position as president, effective immediately. This court recommends a full investigation into her activities for potential criminal charges." John exhaled, the weight of weeks of stress lifting from his shoulders. He glanced at Lisa, who gave him a small, triumphant smile. Margaret, seated in the gallery, gave him a thumbs up, her eyes sparkling with vindication. As Diane was escorted out of the courtroom, her head hung low, John couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a message to everyone who had ever been wronged by those who thought they were above the rules. "Thank you," he said to Lisa as they walked out of the courthouse. "You earned it," she replied. "Now go enjoy your home. You've more than earned that, too." For John, the fight was over, and his sanctuary was safe once more. The days following the court's decision felt like a fresh start for John Miller. For the first time in weeks, the weight pressing down on his shoulders had lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of triumph. The garden, once torn apart by Diane's hired hands, now stood as a symbol of resilience. John spent long afternoons replanting the flowers his wife had once loved, bright marigolds, fragrant lavender, and the sturdy oak sapling she'd nurtured from a seedling. As he dug his hands into the soil, he felt a deep connection to the home he had fought so hard to protect. The neighborhood had noticed his victory. Slowly, one by one, neighbors stopped by, offering congratulations or simply nodding in silent support. Margaret, his staunchest ally, arrived with a tray of cookies and a broad smile. "You've done more than win your case, John," she said. "You've reminded all of us that we have the power to stand up to bullies like Diane." John chuckled. "Well, I couldn't have done it without you. Those cookies might have been the real secret weapon." The ripple effects of the trial were evident. Diane Harper's name had become synonymous with scandal, and the HOA was in disarray. New leadership was hastily elected, with a focus on transparency and accountability. The bylaws were reviewed, ensuring no homeowner could be blindsided by retroactive decisions again. For the first time in years, the HOA seemed like it might actually serve the community rather than control it. And then there was Diane herself. The once dominant figure who had lorded over the neighborhood with an iron fist was now conspicuously absent. Her carefully curated facade had crumbled, replaced by whispers of her upcoming criminal investigation. Her house, with its ostentatious pool and gaudy decorations, now bore a bright "For Sale" sign planted firmly on the lawn. One crisp autumn morning, John sat on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The sun cast a warm glow over the street, and the smell of freshly mowed grass filled the air. From his vantage point, he could see Diane's house across the way, her belongings being loaded into a moving truck. A satisfied grin spread across his face. "Queen Elizabeth has abdicated," he said, more to himself than anyone else. But his victory wasn't just personal. It became a rallying cry for others in the neighborhood and beyond. John's story began to circulate, inspiring homeowners across the country to challenge unfair practices and fight for their rights. Letters and emails poured in from strangers, thanking him for standing up to what felt like an unstoppable system. For John, though, the most rewarding part was the simple peace of being home. As he watched the morning unfold, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the win, but for the people who had stood by him, for the memories preserved, and for the future now free of Diane's shadow. The garden bloomed again, the house stood strong, and John's porch, where so many battles had begun, was once more a place of solace. For a man who had faced down both personal loss and public injustice, this was the ultimate victory. And as the wind rustled the leaves of the oak tree in his yard, John knew one thing for sure: home was worth fighting for.